Hello and welcome back to the channel. In a recent video I talked about the potential rise of the EU as a sort of superbloc as a result of the conflicts in Ukraine. That was a very speculative sort of video, sort of a bit of a thought experiment as it were, and it seemed to have generated quite a lot of interest. So I've been pleasantly surprised by how interested people are in that. So in this video I thought I'd do a bit of a counter to that. And I thought I would talk about the US, and that isn't speculative because the US is the most dominant superpower in the world today. And of course many people make the assumptions that as a consequence of that the US are extremely strong when it comes to negotiating. And whilst that is broadly true, it is not always true. And there's lots of interesting quirks and things about that. So I thought in this video I would talk about the US as the superpower, and rather than being speculative, this is actually going to be a more practical sort of video. Now, for those who perhaps are new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator. I'm a professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience in international negotiations. That includes dealing with US negotiators on a regular basis. So I'm going to be drawing upon all my practical knowledge to explain how things work in this video. And if any of my US friends and colleagues happen to be listening to this channel, let's hope not, I love you guys really, and we do have a great professional relationship, but of course everything I say in here you know is true really. So let's get into this and let's talk about the US. Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way first, I think, because of course we do know the US are dominant. So let's talk a little bit about what that means in negotiation terms. So of course they have a huge amount of economic power. So what that means is when you're negotiating up against any US negotiator, whether it's a company or the government, they will usually have a lot of financial clout behind them. That is an advantage. No doubt, no denying that. But we'll talk more about that as we go along. We're of course also talking about the US as a large military, and they outspend everybody when it comes to the military spend and what they have. And they have some tremendous capabilities that cannot be matched by any other nation. So not just they outspend, but they have stuff that is world leading. So that gives not just violent power, shall we say, but it gives them the more soft diplomatic power. They have that ability to mean what they say. And that, of course, is also important and influential when it comes to the US government when it tries to negotiate on any particular issue. And of course, tailing away from the military side of things and perhaps into the more practical ways that the US tend to dominate the world, the dollar, of course, is the fiat currency. It's used to buy things, particularly petrol, gas, I suppose I should say, in the US, or oil, I should probably say. So the petrodollar is a massive influence, but the dollar is a reference currency for so many people, so many nations, so many markets. And that is an influential power all in its own. And of course the US has offices and influence everywhere, all over the globe. Whether there's an embassy, consulate, whether even just a company or a McDonald's, whatever it may be. That is the ability of the US to project influence into various locations. And along with that comes the ability to leverage that influence for their benefit. So they're also at the heart of everything. So the US will quite often be the dominant voice at various institutions, whether that be the UN, World Trade Organization, and a whole host of others. And for things to get done, you need the US to back your position. That tends to be the cardinal rule on the international circuit. So that again is another huge factor in their favour. All of these things are true. But of course it doesn't mean the US can win at everything. And quite often the US doesn't win at everything. So if you're a negotiator going up against US negotiators, you don't need to feel awed and intimidated by their size. There's lots of things you can do that will give you the advantage, and that perhaps is the whole purpose of this video, to explain that. So, before I go into that, a quick step backwards. When it comes to negotiating at international level, simply put, there are two drivers: self-interest and enlightened self-interest. Now, for anyone who might be a student of international relations who's watching this video, I'm sure they're already shouting at the screen, "Oh, what about the Marxist theory of international relations, or Hobsbawm, or cultural relativism, or anything like that?" My advice to those students is learn all of that, do what you need to do to pass the exams, and when you graduate, throw those books away, because they are totally and utterly unrepresentative of the real world. And the reason for that is that academics need to justify having their jobs, and the reality is actually trying to explain international relations is pretty straightforward, not very sexy. So all those theories, they are exactly that, theories. Even Marxists don't practice international relations theory. No one does. It simply comes down to self-interest and enlightened self-interest. It honestly is that straightforward when it comes to international relations and how people negotiate on various issues. Now, self-interest is fairly self-explanatory, but the one thing I will add on to that is that you need to understand what sits behind self-interest when a country is negotiating. So it is not always necessarily in the country's self-interest. It could be in the self-interest of the political leaders of that country. Two great examples of that right now is what Putin is doing in Ukraine with Russia. It is in his self-interest, arguably, to invade Ukraine, certainly not in Russia's interest. So he is driving that agenda, and also what Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party are doing to the UK in terms of Brexit and the international circuit. That is very much their self-interest to the detriment of the UK's international self-interest. And there's lots of arguments that support that perspective. So I'll highlight that as an example that you need to understand what is perhaps short-term politically driven self-interest versus what is the long-term country's self-interest. Because in the long term, leaders come and go, and all countries operate on the basis of self-interest, trying to do things that benefits them, benefits their population, and their ability to influence the world around them, as well as what happens within their countries. When it comes to enlightened self-interest, no doubt many people will sort of also say to me, well, what about all those countries that do things with no reward? They want to do good things to help nations that are struggling in the developed world. And yes, that is true. They do. Quite often that is driven by political leadership, who, political leader may come into power and make a particular point that they want to improve something internationally and bend that country's efforts toward doing that. That indeed does happen. But by and large, when it comes to the long term, most countries, even when they're doing that, they're doing so because it is in their long-term benefit to help others. This is not to say that it should not be welcomed, that they do various things that help others that are struggling, and particularly the developed world. But it has to be understood that even when they're being altruistic, it is actually to their benefit that those countries are improved in some way. And I'm going to give an example of that. I thought I'd have a bit of an example that perhaps might explain this concept. It's a difficult one perhaps to explain, so it's a simpler way to use an example. And I've taken the humble tractor. So let's imagine a scenario where the US has gifted many thousands of tractors to country A. Country A is a poor developed country, and of course needs those tractors in order to massively improve its agricultural output. So obviously the more it can feed its people, the more it can lift them out of poverty, the more economic activity it can generate, etc., etc. So this sort of policy might be driven by a US senator, a US congressman that just feels that what is happening in country A is unfair and the US should do something to help them. And so they do. They donate many thousands of US-made tractors, brand new, great tractors, can do all sorts of wonderful things. So of course, country A can now use those tractors, to generate agricultural and economic activity. But of course, what actually happens is country A is now dependent upon the US when it comes to using those tractors. Tractor parts don't last forever. They break down, they need replacing, they need servicing. So what happens is, as a result of that gift, the tractor company now has a foothold in the market of country A. And country A is dependent upon that company to help them. And it can be a critical dependency. If your output is completely reliant on those tractors, then that US company has a very strong hold on your politics, on your decision making, and your economy. So country A needs to fund maintaining those tractors. And the most common way of doing this, of course, is to use national resources. That could be oil, that could be diamonds, gold, coal, whatever other things. And so country A will use those resources to secure more spare parts, perhaps even more tractors, and in order to expand their economic and agricultural activity. And of course, having done all that, country A has improved supply and reduced poverty. So a net benefit, you might say. And then the country might get to the next stage of being able to export that produce, possibly back to the US, but maybe just to other countries, for their resources, their cash, whatever it may be. So as a result of all of that, country A becomes a little bit wealthier. And of course, country A will need to spend that wealth. Now this is where US soft power / hard power comes into play. In a hard power sense, US company can mandate that country A can only spend within their market. So if you're buying the tractor parts, they can only buy the tractor parts from the US, for example. But the soft power stuff is, they don't even never need to say that. They don't need to apply that hard target. And so country A enjoys working with the US. It has a good relationship, had lots of people that speak English, for example. And so country A will voluntarily make the choice to spend more money with the US, within the US market, and outside of just tractors and tractor parts. Then they'll buy other things. They might be luxury goods. Maybe they'll expand into livestock or clothing, textiles, whatever it may be. So they buy more from the US. So what they do is they create, the US gains more of a hold on that country. It may have been a gift to the company originally, but now the US has significant and growing influence in country A. So here we have a very classic example of enlightened self-interest. So what, of course, one hopes, of course, that would always be used for good. I'm afraid, of course, there are plenty of examples where that might get stretched a little bit. So it can be argued, and many people do argue, that creating that level of dependency can be a bad thing, even with a country that has been kind enough to gift you many thousands of tractors. So what can country A do? Well, there's lots of things country A can do, but I picked this particular example as one of the more common and one of the more effective ones. So what country A can do, let's say country A had very good relationships with its neighbours, and we'll call them country B and C. And what country A says to B and C is, these tractors are fantastic, we should get more of them. But what we should do is pool together so that we can jointly buy all the tractors and all the spare parts. So they form, let's call it a regional union, to do that. Now this gives them considerably more buying power. So what they can do, they can go to the US tractor company and they can say, we're going to give you this huge contract for tractors, but there's a condition attached. You need to build those tractors in one of our 3 countries, whether in A, B or C. You pick, but you need to build them. We want a factory, and we want, we want jobs. We want self-sufficiency in tractors. Now the US company will usually say yes to this sort of deal. They might haggle around the edges, but of course they want that lucrative deal. Because at the end of the day, it is far more lucrative to do that to a regional bloc than it is one country. And the reason why I say do that as a bloc and not as country A alone is because it may simply be uneconomic to do so. It may be too expensive for country A to make this same demand. And the US company may say, well, it's just not worth it. There's no way I can sell enough tractors in your country to justify all that capital expense. But by pairing up with 2 other countries, suddenly the ratio changes and it does become economically viable. And so it is in the US company's interest to agree to those conditions. And so they do. What those 3 countries then do is they agree a security supply agreement. So it doesn't matter where that factory is located, all 3 of them have full and unfettered access to it. So they can all get spare parts, they can all buy more all tractors at a good rate. And what they also do is they get it rebadged. So whatever the US name is, they give it a local name. So same tractor, perhaps different colouring, but given a different name. And the reason why that is important is because then those countries can sell that tractor to other neighbours. And let's say, for the sake of argument, because this is quite common, those countries wouldn't be seen dead buying US. It's particularly true in several countries. Being US is not necessarily an advantage. So again, this is a benefit for the US tractor company, because suddenly, by setting up a factory in that local market and by rebadging the product, they can access a whole bunch of other countries that they normally cannot access as a US flagged company. But of course they get the revenue. Yes, they may not be directly building those tractors in the US, but of course they're negotiating a license fee. So for every tractor sold, they get a cut. So this is a net win for everybody concerned. So that's how this sort of deal goes down. And then of course those 3 countries will expand. They will build upon that success, and they might, buy seeds. They could buy seeds from a US company. They could buy seeds from other companies, whether in Europe or Asia, for example. And so they can expand their range of crops. So what these union companies then do is they then leverage all that capital investment that they have made in the tractor factory and into seeds and so on to become exporters, to get more money, to become wealthier, essentially. But here's the crucial difference. They become wealthier whilst also not being fully dependent upon the US for supply of the tractors and spare parts. All of that is contained within their region. So what they have done by following this particular model, this is a very common model to follow, by the way, particularly in Europe and the more developed world. They will always do this when dealing with the US because they recognize how important it is to do this. If they cut down that level of dependency, and by cutting down that level of dependency and by building regional partnerships and allies, you're able to better secure decent deals when it comes to negotiating future deals. And it could be the US, it could be with someone else. So that is, with a very simple tractor example, how one country can use its influence locally to gain friends, to gain partnerships, in order to improve its negotiation position with a big superpower like the US. It's a very simple example, but honestly, it is extremely common. Now, of course, you can't always do that. As a country, quite often you have to go one-to-one with the US on any specific issue. Now, here's a key thing that people do tend to forget. It's an important international principle and applies pretty much universally. And that is, nations are sovereign. So this means when they negotiate, they are there as equals. That is because no matter how big and powerful the US is, the US cannot necessarily dictate to a country what decision they make. You can invade a country, you can do all sorts of other unpleasant things to it, and Putin is indeed demonstrating that with Ukraine. But what Putin cannot do is dictate to Ukraine as an external negotiation what decision Ukraine should make. And this is universally true, and this is no different when you're negotiating with the US. What happens at the negotiation table is one thing, but what happens inside your country's border is totally the decision of your country. The US very rarely has an ability to totally, they can influence it, but they can't totally control it. So this is an important thing to remember when you're negotiating against a more powerful country, is that in that negotiation room, you're actually there as equals. You both have the ability to say yes and no to things, to walk away from the deal if you're not happy. And size doesn't have to matter unless you make it matter. So yes, the US, of course, will have more money. They will have more economic influence. They'll have various things that they can do. But if that doesn't matter to you, and if you don't let it matter to you, then as a negotiator, that doesn't have to be an advantage that the US can use on you. The real trick is that you have your own advantage. No one's ever going to outspend the US. That is a cardinal rule. They will always turn up with more money. So this is why I'm not bothered talking about financial advantage here. But let's say, and we go back to our tractor example, let's say that the roles reverse. The US wants your tractor because it is a world-beaten tractor, far, far superior to the US one. Well, you've got a technological advantage. That's something they want. So what that means is they're prepared to negotiate and offer you fairly decent deals. And because they have lots of money, those deals can be quite lucrative. So the important thing to do is to recognize you have that advantage and to use it as part of the negotiation and not to be too awed. If you genuinely know that you've got the best thing ever, then there's certain things you're not going to agree in the US. So the US, for example, might try to use their financial power to insist on an exclusivity deal. At the end of the day, if you have a whole host of other countries, whether in Asia, whether in Europe, for example, queuing up to buy your fantastic product, then you don't actually need to agree an exclusivity deal with the US. You can tell them no. You can tell them perhaps you'd agree a national exclusivity deal, but certainly not an international one. So that's an advantage you can play. The other thing is also people. It's very easy for the US to have the advantage on technology, on money and so on. It's less easy for them to have the advantage in people with real deep knowledge and skills. So you may have people who are able to influence local markets, local areas, and the US just doesn't have that. You can't just, grab an American, throw them into a foreign market and suddenly they're an expert. It doesn't work that way. So if you have those kinds of experts and that knowledge is something that the US wants to tap into, and that again is another advantage that you can use as part of your negotiation. And people quite often forget that. So as always, with any kind of negotiation, you need to have done the preparation, you need to have done the analysis, and you need to have assessed the balance of power. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And so of course you will want to exploit the US weaknesses in order to improve your bargaining position. And the US does have weaknesses. Powerful as the US are, they can't be exceptionally good at everything. And they do have certain generally true handicaps. Not always true, but generally true. So here's a few of them. And to say these can vary depending on the scenario, so don't take this as always true. They tend to have a conventional approach, US negotiators. And this is one of the slight downsides of being the big kids on the block, is that when you are big and powerful, you don't actually struggle that hard to get your own way. So you slightly lack that ability to innovate, because you don't have to compete with certain pressures and ways of thinking. So what that means is the way they think can be quite conventional. Generally very competent. Generally they will know what they're doing, but they won't necessarily be able to think outside the box, to use a horrible cliche phrase, sometimes. And this is not universally true. There are plenty of Americans who are very capable of thinking outside the box. So I'm talking about in general negotiation terms. The next sort of weakness worth thinking about is that quite often the US will bring real deep specialists, and these will be people that will have exceptional levels of knowledge in their chosen field. So that, in theory, gives them an advantage. But there's a downside here as well. And quite often, those individuals have become specialists by becoming very good in a narrow topic, in a narrow field. And the US can afford to do this because quite often the US will have more money and more people to throw at any particular problem. That has various advantages, but it has a certain disadvantage that when you overman to solve problems, then you end up with people who don't have that broad breadth of experience, that broader way of tackling a problem. They will know their very specific field and they will know it exceptionally well. No one will be able to beat them in those particular fields. But if you're able to have a broader base of knowledge, then that gives you a certain degree of flexibility and maneuverability that the US people will not have. So that is quite a common weakness that you tend to find. You also find that the US negotiators operate within a hierarchical decision making. That means that everything you agree with them is very much an agreement in principle, but they have to go back and get an awful lot of people to agree to it before they can confirm that that agreement is solid. In contrast, if you bring people who are able to make decisions at the negotiations, that gives you a certain advantage. You're able to move more quickly, you're able to be more decisive, and you're also able more to understand the trade-offs that you're agreeing to. Because of the hierarchical decision making, not just prevalent in the US, it's prevalent in lots of countries, but the US can be particularly subject to it. But because of that hierarchical decision making, that means it's much harder for them to work through that trade-offs there and then. It can be a bit disjointed. So that's the weakness that can be exploited. And another crucial weakness is that because the US are so big, they have a rather large amount of bureaucracy and regulations. This really hampers their ability to get into the details of things and to negotiate in a more flexible way. So any country that is able to operate in a more agile and flexible way can exploit these weaknesses in order to improve their position and to improve their self-interest that they're trying to negotiate. So I imagine these things shouldn't come as news to any professional who's negotiated with the US, but I would caution that do not always assume that these are true. There are plenty of cases when the US will not have these particular weaknesses. These are just some of the more common and the ones that turn up more frequently. So, what are my final thoughts when it comes to anyone trying to negotiate with the US? Well, always remember that powerful as they are, that is actually not their true strength when it comes to negotiations as a country, particularly at international level. Their true power lies in the way they're the centre of everything. When you set the rules, you hold an awful lot of power. When you're at the hub of all those international institutions, all those partnerships and so on, then you can leverage that influence for your national interest. And the US does. So many countries know this and have to operate within it. Very much, align with the US or form a bloc against them. So the US, of course, does have many advantages. They have a huge economy, a huge industrial technical base, and they're able to use that to bring it to any particular negotiation. But, let's say, the US cannot be powerful everywhere, and the US always needs countries that are willing to work with them in a spirit of cooperation in order to achieve common aims, enlightened self-interest, perhaps. And so the final point I want to make is for those who want to understand why the US is influential and why countries like Russia and China can never match the US, despite the fact that on paper those countries may have similar advantages. They may have massive landmass, lots of people, lots of resources, admittedly still in the ground type resources. But it's not just the fact that they cannot leverage those advantages to maximum effect. That prevents them from being more influential than they are. The reality is they're not the rule setters. They're not the central voice at those institutions and those partnerships. And that is, if nothing else, what the current Ukraine conflict is really revealing to everybody. Is that true power doesn't just lie in being the big kid in the block. It's being the person that people listen to the most. And I think this is what Russia and China are perhaps realizing, is they do have lots of strong relationships with various countries around the world. But that is not quite enough. And that's not what's going to give them all the advantages. So I hope you found this video interesting. And please, if anyone does disagree with my analysis here, or has a very different experience when it comes to negotiating against the US as a big power, then please do share your experiences in the comment box below. And yes, please do like and subscribe if you enjoy this sort of content.